Pas lu ou quoi?
Cutter in the Doha Forum, as well as the Munich Security Conference for sponsoring this panel. I think we're going to have a dynamic discussion with these ladies who have a lot of experience in this topic. So let me tell you a little bit about them to begin. Marietta Schacke is a member of the European Parliament for the Dutch Democratic Party with the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. She's been so since 2009. Oh, hello. Whoa. Okay. My apologies, I didn't realize the microphone wasn't working, so I think I might just start over from the beginning. Welcome to this session, Bit by Bit Enforcing Norms in Cyberspace. My name is Kate Bauer. I'm from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'd like to start by thanking Qatar and the Doha Forum, as well as the Munich Security Conference for hosting the session, for sponsoring the session and having us here in lovely Doha today. I think we're going to have a dynamic discussion with these ladies who have a lot of background in the topic that we have in front of us. First to my left is Marietta Schacke, who's a member of the European Parliament for the Dutch Democratic Party. She has been so since 2009. She serves on the International Trade Committee and is the spokesperson for the ALDE Group on Transatlantic Trade and Investment Agreements. She also serves on the Committee on Foreign Affairs and on the Subcommittee on Human Rights. She's the founder of the European Parliament Intergroup on the Digital Agenda for Europe. To her left is Lata Reddy, who is the former Deputy National Security Advisor of India, in which position she was responsible for cybersecurity and other critical internal and external security issues. She also served as a commissioner on the Global Commission on Internet Governance. Ms. Reddy is involved with several organizations and think tanks now, both globally and in India. She is currently, among other positions, serving as a distinguished fellow in the East-West Institute in the US, the Observer Research Foundation in India, and the Center for International Governance Innovation in Canada. To her far left, we have Dr. Hessa Al-Jaber, who is a former Qatari Minister of Information and Communications. She is currently the chairperson of Trio Investment, a technology investment company that invests in innovative technology to address some of the most pressing health problems in the MENA region. She is an expert in technology, media, and telecom practice. Her focus is on the impact of a digital economy in productivity and competitiveness. So thank you very much to these three. I want to start off by trying to bring some context to the discussion of cybersecurity, of cyber norms. And I'd ask that generally to have our speakers kind of speak to this issue of what is a cyber norm and why are they important? And if we decide that it is important that we do this, who should be deciding in setting these and what challenges have we faced? So I'll ask Marietta to start off discussing just what is kind of the scope of the issue in front of us.
Thank you very much. It's good to see you all. Thank you to the Munich Security Conference for bringing us together and to show that experts can be women all at the same time. What are we talking about? Because the question I often get when we talk about cybersecurity or human rights online or anything that relates to the global open internet is why can't we just work with the laws that we have? And the good news is that at the UN, but also at the European level, and increasingly this is a shared view, the idea is that laws that apply offline should also apply online. So non-discrimination, freedom of expression, fair competition should also be respected online. But that doesn't really cover all the issues that we're talking about. Because every day we can read about breaches, cyber attacks, leaks. We read yesterday that millions of people have posted pictures that they had thought about posting on Facebook were now, because of some bug, public. And at the same time, this is quite shocking, the question is who will be held to account? Will there be consequences, and what can be done to prevent these kinds of incidents? And it is not necessarily easy when you have companies that span the globe, when you have governments with different visions on what ethics look like or what is just and what is an unjust intervention, and when you have the expertise on the technology not necessarily sitting in governments or companies, but maybe in academic institutions or with civil society. So the idea that is now taking hold about developing norms with all these different stakeholders, governments, the private sector, civil society, and experts, is that we should think about those areas where very different people, different actors can come together in agreement of how we can increase the stability and the resilience of cyberspace. So to prevent attacks, to prevent hybrid warfare, to prevent the worst of all impacts for the very people that we have to be concerned about, whether they are here or on the other side of the world. And so just to give you a few examples, together with Letta, but with some other people from different walks of life, we serve on a commission called the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. And what this commission of experts from government and the private sector, academia, and civil society do is to think about what areas can we agree on in terms of coming together and assessing how we can prevent the worst of all escalations. And so some of the examples are a norm of non-attack of the public core of the open internet. So the technological infrastructure, the routers, the domain name system. Another area is, for example, electoral infrastructure. It is a very hot topic these days, but if there could be a norm between companies and countries and others not to attack there, this would go a long way in raising the bar of actually having agreement globally and preventing the worst kinds of attacks and destabilizing of the open internet that we all depend upon. And hopefully, because despite our differences, there are still areas where we all suffer. If there's instability, this can be an incentive to come together around norms.
Thank you. Dr. Jaber, I'm wondering if you can comment on some of the challenges that we face in reaching a consensus on these issues, and how we can incentivize countries to act in support of these norms, even when it's potentially not in their interests.
Thank you. I'd just like to discuss this in maybe different from different dimensions. 100% norm is very critical, and bilateral agreement between countries are critical, but I really don't think that bilateral agreement or multilateral agreement will work for the cyberspace. And we really, and I think history tells us that, and I don't want to make this very dramatic, but first time we hear about cyber war in 1984. If we will think about cyber war like any other war or like an atomic war, we know that history tells us the only things to control the war between to control the arm race between two countries 100% through formal international agreement. But for space, this will not work, because if we will go through how we would like to explain the multilateral agreement, and I will take an example, the one for the nuclear weapon. It has so many characteristics, but four characteristics that exist between all multilateral agreement. Number one, they are clear. So a number of entities are clear who are in this agreement. Number two, it is a relatively easy and effective way to identify cheater. So if two countries went in a multilateral agreement, it is easy to identify which one is not complying. Number three, it is long time to prepare to perform cheating. And the last one is there is the ability to reciprocate. If I will take these four things and I will compare it to the cyber war, I think if we will go the first one, in the clear and number of entities involved. In the case of, I will take a nuclear bomb. The amount of infrastructure and investment required makes it impossible for any entity different from major state to develop a nuclear bomb. But if you will go through a cyber war, it's any small entity. It can be developed in the basement. It can be developed so, and you cannot hold any country accountable about a specific war or specific malware that was exist from that country, or it is very hard even to indicate that this war is starting from that country. The second thing, it is very easy and effective way to identify cheater when it comes to the nuclear multilateral agreement. In case of a nuclear bomb, using a range of technology, we can use satellite, and through the satellite, I think we see it now between the US and North Korea. So they can really know what's happening on the movement of their nuclear weapon. But when it comes to cyber war, it's very hard to identify what is happening or where this will be happen. The third point, it is when it comes to any multilateral agreement related to war or to whatever, it is there is ability to reciprocate. And I think it's my first time to go through a number of agreements on the atomic bomb, and it's very clear that when a bomb is, if there is a multilateral agreement between two countries, and if there is an atomic bomb come to a specific country, they have the right to reciprocate it at that moment. But when it comes to cyber war, we really don't know the origin. We really don't know if this is happening. And I just like to bring now maybe a very clear case. It's what happened for Qatar when we have the malware or the virus or whatever we call it for the Qatar National News Agency. It was very hard in the beginning to identify this is coming from. Even after a couple of months after we identified, it's very hard to hold this specific country that they are responsible for it. So personally, and I think, and I know I'm not a dreamer, I'm more realistic. I do believe that the multilateral agreement work, the norm will work, but each country should have, beside the multilateral agreement, beside establishing the norm, beside establishing the law or the international law, each country should do three things. They really should have the tools to prevent their critical infrastructure from any cyber attack. Number two, they should have intelligence. And the way I see the intelligence is two parts. It is domestic intelligence, where each country should put probes in their critical infrastructure to make sure that they will be able to identify any suspicion attack. They should also have foreign intelligence, and the way I like this foreign intelligence, they really should monitor. They should be monitoring hacker group. They should monitor dark web. They should follow what's happening in public internet, so they will be able to identify and to use maybe AI to use to do a lot of analytics to be able to predict if there is an attack will come to them. The third thing, I believe that each country should 100% build local capability. I know in the West this is not very critical, but in our region we really like local capability when it comes to cyber security. And I'm a big believer that we really need to develop our local capability, the regional local capability when it comes to cyber security. So what I think, norm more, but I really don't think that norm and multilateral agreement can work separately. I do believe that each country should have the tool from prevention to intelligence to local capability to be able to stand in this cyber war.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Jaber. Lata. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with ASEAN and the regional approach that's been taken, as well as the status of these efforts at the UN level?
Well, let me start by picking up on a couple of points that Dr. Hassan said, and then I'll get on to ASEAN. I can't say I agree with the point that we cannot develop international norms, or we should not develop international norms because there's a need to build national capability. I don't see it as a zero-sum game. I don't think it's an either-or situation. Obviously, every country has to build its own national capacity, both for combating cybercrime, the use of cyber for terror, as well as simply to have the tools to fight cyber attacks and to detect them and to build resilience into their internet systems, to actually know when an attack is happening, and to have there are systems like the Computer Emergency Response Teams or CERTs, which are national CERTs, which work together with other CERTs. But that's a primary responsibility of each government, of each country, of each nation, to safeguard its own citizens' security, and part of that is safeguarding their cybersecurity. But at the same time that you're doing that, simply because cyber is such a borderless domain, and because attribution is difficult, but the fact of the matter is it could be coming from very much outside your system. How will only developing national capacity address that problem? So I think it has to be a combination of building national capacity and developing international norms. We've seen good examples of bilateral agreements where countries have agreed to help each other on cyber attacks. I've seen examples of good regional arrangements. The most difficult is to find a universally acceptable multilateral agreement, and that's what we've been struggling with for the last few years. I won't say it's easy, because geopolitical differences come in the way. There are different countries who believe in different roles for their sovereignty and their authority. There is what I call digital nationalism, which gets in the way of international agreements. But ASEAN, I will get to that, Kate, that ASEAN essentially did a very good job, as did the European Union before that. And as Marete will tell you, that in the European Union to get, what is it now, 27 or 29 countries? 28 countries, to all agree to a common position on cybersecurity and sharing of information on cyber attacks, how you're going to address cybercrime is not easy. But they did it, and ASEAN has done it as well. And I was very impressed. I was in Singapore in September for the Cyber Week, and the ASEAN ministers made a public acknowledgement that all 10 countries of the ASEAN have agreed to work together on cybersecurity, share their training, share their best practices, share their knowledge, their technical knowledge, and it was welcomed by everyone. And they agreed also, because there's always going to be in a group of countries, some countries which are more advanced technologically than the others. That's always the tricky bit. And what ASEAN managed to do, and what I suspect the EU managed to do also, is an agreement that those countries that were more technologically advanced would help those who were less technologically advanced. And that's what happens with regional cooperation, and eventually we hope with international cooperation, because there's no sense each of us trying to reinvent the wheel. If we can share our knowledge about the wheel will become universal. That's the way I look at it. And as for norms not having been agreed to, this is not entirely true, because the 2015 UNGGE, or Governmental Group of Experts, did agree in principle to several norms. The difficulty was that these norms were voluntary and non-binding. They were not binding on countries, and that brings me to what you originally raised, Kate, which is what is a norm. A norm comes first, Based on the norm, you then create a principle. Based on the principle, you then create a treaty or a law. Once you've signed the international agreements, each individual country has to go back and legislate it into national law. And finally, and that's the toughest part, you implement the norm, which has in the meantime become a law. But it can be done. It has been done in different areas, and it takes a lot of time and patience. And I would say this really seriously began only about 20 years ago in 1998, when the first committee of the UN started talking about a universal agreement on cybersecurity. So if you look at it, 20 years is not very long in a medium that's changing all the time. And it's not going to be easy, because the minute we've dealt with one lot of norms, it's going to be time to start designing the second lot of norms, because you'll have the new dilemmas thrown up by artificial intelligence, robotics, the whole host of uses to which the new technologies will be put. There'll be ethical dilemmas, and there'll be religious dilemmas. So how are we going to deal with all of that if we don't get down to trying to at least agree on some basic norms? The two that Marete mentioned are very important. We've come up with another 6, but I won't read them all out. But it's interesting, because I worked a lot with the private sector and with academia, and there's almost total agreement in all the lists, whether brought out by the industry, whether brought out by government, whether brought out by academia, whether brought out by civil society. There is an agreement that these are the main concerns that should make cyberspace safer. And if these are addressed, this is what we need. So I think it's got to be multi-sectoral, it's got to be multi-stakeholder, and you've got to have lots of consultations before you start the formal negotiations, and there has to be a way to bring all these voices on board during the negotiations. Can't just be governments.
Thank you. One of the things I find interesting about this issue, and I don't think this is exclusive to looking at cyber norms or cybersecurity, is that a lot of the underlying malicious activity is already, there's consensus that it's bad activity. So what you're talking about is kind of on the margins. It's in these areas that are gray, and that's where it's difficult to reach broader consensus. So in an absence for now, at least, a kind of enforceable mechanism or consensus around norms and codifying them in international law. How can regional agreements or even bilateral agreements, are they effective? Can they protect parties from malicious cyber-based activity undertaken by either other state actors or sub-state actors, non-state actors in other jurisdictions?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to start thinking about it a bit out loud, because it's not so much, I think, about marginal issues where there's not consensus yet. It's also about incentivizing not only states, but also companies to show their commitment to high standards and to taking responsibility. And I think it is also a sort of invitation to show their true colors, because as you said in the beginning, and as was mentioned also by Dr. Al-Jaber, it's not always visible where attacks take place, it's not always visible where vulnerability is. So if we take the analogy of nuclear weapons, where it took about 30 years to come to non-proliferation treaties, so I mean, thinking about principles to having agreements can take decades, right? But in the nuclear case, you have states with scarce capacity. I mean, you and I don't have nuclear bombs, as far as I'm concerned. And you have, let's say, a button for attack that one person or very, very few people with high clearances can push. Compare that to the digital domain, where everybody has a button to push, and where a weakness in one of our devices or in a value chain of an element that's in one of our phones, for example, can be exploited and can be poisoning, jeopardizing the entire ecosystem. So it's much more abundant, and it creates a much bigger possible surface for attack. And so what is different between the digital domain and the nuclear context is that you have many more actors that can play a role, many more weaknesses that can be exploited. And so what you need to do is to bring many more people on board across borders, across sectors, and with different levels of development. And that is very, very challenging. And a norm can begin to focus all these minds together around a principle where people can say, yeah, that makes sense, because if we don't agree on this principle, we all suffer. And that is what is the same with the nuclear issue. There's mutual dependence, right? If there is a nuclear attack, many, many people will suffer, and there's a risk of retaliation. When you look at the digital arena, if one person gets attacked, let's say a bank, or the banking infrastructure that's global, then both banks and consumers, citizens and states and the stock markets will all be impacted by this attack. So there is a convergence, there is an area where despite different political systems, despite different profit models, despite competing businesses, there's still a shared interest in coming together. And that's what these norms are supposed to do. And I think you can do it through beginning in a region like the EU, where we have a Cybersecurity Act that's now being built, but we also have other laws like how to handle data protection or how to safeguard net neutrality. But it makes more sense for us in the EU because we have mechanisms of making laws for 28 countries. That is all fairly advanced. But with the global internet impacting so many more people than even us in Europe or people in ASEAN or those combined, we need to think about how we can go to the next level. And that's how I see the discussion on norms. I really think it is the next level beyond regional agreements, beyond sectoral agreements, beyond the application of existing laws, is how we can take that next step to make everybody safer and to create a rules-based approach to this.
I'd just like to add to that. You know, I think, for instance, if you think that the EU has 28 members and ASEAN has 10 members, straight away, if the EU and the ASEAN have a common position on something, you've got 38 countries on board. And seeing that example, other regional organizations could come forward to say, well, we'll endorse these norms as well. And for instance, I think the 2015 GG norms have been endorsed by numbers of countries saying we will support them, we're prepared to take them on board. ASEAN has supported them. I think the EU also to a large extent has Mariche. So I would say that you've already got 50 countries saying we all agree to cooperate along these lines, and these are fairly specific norms, including addressing the question of individual or non-state actors, because there is one norm in the UNGG norms that actually talks about will states take responsibility for wrongful acts, you know, committed on their territory by non-state actors. So that states should. So then it's a question of how do you go forward and create a mechanism of what kind of responsibility they'll take, what kind of punishment they'll face, and what would be the sanctions and what would be the court or forum in which they could be judged. So there's a lot of work ahead, as I said, but I think getting the agreement is not so difficult. I think the implementation mechanisms are going to be more complicated to work out.
Dr. Aljabiga.
I think they closed the door.
Yeah, I'd just like to reassure that 100% norm in cyberspace is very critical, and it's very critical to build it. Having an international law and having an entity, I think that will be like a dream, where there is an entity where if there is any attack anywhere, all countries can go to this entities, and this entity will be having this very strong international, that they have the people to reinforce and to do the investigation and to make sure that was responsible. This is very critical, but I really believe that this is alone cannot solve the vulnerability and the cyber security issue. 100% each country should be equipped to be able to protect, to be able to have that intelligent information, and to be able to have their local capability. And to answer your question, will multilateral agreement will work? I think it will work if there is a small group of countries that they share same interest. It's very important that if two countries they share different interests, and I think I raised one point. It's very hard. Let's assume I'm making this an example. Country X, they went with country Y, and they made this this agreement regarding cyber security. Because having, and as you said, the attribution is very, very hard. So if country Y attack country X, it's very hard for country Y, for country X to find that or to blame country X to do, because they can do it directly or they can do it indirectly. So like I'm staying in my X country and I can hire a hacker underground from Y country to send viruses or a malware to another country. So unless there is real common interest for those two countries or for this group of small countries to have this multilateral agreement for protection, and maybe in Europe it's different because all the 28 countries have common interest. But I think, if I will give an example, what's happening between the US and China, they only agree on one item, and that's it. So it's very, very, very hard, and my assumption it will be very hard to enforce it.
Thank you. And of course, you're talking about the U.S.-China agreement that was very narrowly worded to address targeting commercial intellectual property. Of course.
I wanted to respond because I think the question of attribution, in other words, to be able to say, this is where an attack happened, this entity is guilty, and this is what we're going to do, is of course very sensitive. But it's I think, more sensitive than technically difficult. And when you're from a small country, like maybe Qatar or the Netherlands, a country that I know best, it is even more comfortable to do that with more countries. Because imagine, as recently happened, there were Russian hackers found in the Netherlands to have tried to hack the OPCW, the Organization Against the Proliferation of Chemical Weapons. Okay, so let's imagine that you are the government of the Netherlands and you are aware of this. You know, it is easier to say, we found that Russian intelligence operators have come to hack this UN organization on our soil, if you know that the European Union says, and we support the Netherlands in their assessment, and we think this should have consequences, right? So it's also actually an incentive for countries to work together so that they don't have to be exposed alone in pointing the finger to where they know attacks have come from. But secondly, and I think this is potentially even more important and challenging in this space, governments cannot do this alone anymore. Not only can they not provide for all the services that they need to provide for by themselves, they simply depend on private sector companies, but they also depend on private sector companies to then protect these services. So, you know, if you think in simple terms about this, digitization often means privatization, and it fundamentally changes the, let's say, monopoly of the state on a number of functions that it used to have. And also, therefore, we need to think of new ways to not only bind states that are traditionally the entities that engage in multilateral, bilateral, treaty kind of agreements, but also private sector companies that are not necessarily on the soil of that country. Because it's easy to make a law in Qatar for a Qatari company. That's not so difficult. Much harder when you are in the Netherlands to make sure that Facebook respect the law as you want. And therefore, again, it's often smarter to make a bigger mass of people, like we do in the European Union, because it's harder to say, if you're Facebook, no, we're not going to respect the law that applies to 500 million people, than it is to say, we don't care about 10 million consumers. So this scaling up and bringing different stakeholders together is very much what we need to do if we want to be able to address some of these global challenges in the online domain.
So I can't help myself, but if I can make a brief comment to draw some parallels to something that I spend a lot of time looking at, which is the Financial Action Task Force, which is a standard-setting body for financial regulation, anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing. But this is a body that has set standards, and through an evaluation process has found a way to make them implementable and enforceable. Because of the public nature of the assessments and the kind of reputational dynamics or the potential reputational impact that it can have for not adhering to these things. So I'm seeing a lot of parallels between being able to say, here are the rules, everyone needs to follow them, because the weakest link is where the problem can be. And there needs to be accountability in other jurisdictions for things like that. Also, the role of the private sector, because there's obviously a big role for private sector players here as well. If anyone wants to comment on that, or I was asked to leave some time for questions. So I think first I'll see if there are any comments from the panel, and if not, we'll turn to the audience.
Yeah, I think that's true, because one of the main things on which we need to develop norms is agreements is on the need not to attack critical information infrastructure. Now, critical information is anything that's absolutely essential. Critical infrastructure is what is absolutely essential for a nation's survival. It could be your transport infrastructure, it could be your defense infrastructure, it could be your health infrastructure, and there's a real danger to national security if that is attacked. So obviously, normally attacking the infrastructure would involve a physical attack. When it's a critical information infrastructure, you don't attack the facility itself, you attack the computer networks or the digital systems that control those infrastructures. So I think that if you don't have this kind of mechanism in place, critical infrastructure can't be protected. So in that sense, it's like the Financial Action Task Force. Why was the need felt for a global agreement for the FTF? Because you realize that the financial systems are today so interconnected that if there's one bad egg, or if there's one rotten player, the system gets contaminated, and you need to pay some consequences for carrying out bad actions in using your shifting of funds for money laundering, for terrorist purposes, or for any other reason, which is against the law. And countries did manage to come together for that. So I think critical information infrastructure, you would have to have a similar kind of body that would say attacks on critical infrastructure, at least in peacetime, are completely unwarranted. And that there should be a norm to protect critical information infrastructures. In fact, there should be a positive norm to say that we'll come together to help protect and to share information and to share best practices. There should be a negative norm. And then most of the critical infrastructure is not run just by governments. It's run by the private sector as well as the government. So it's a very good analogy with what, the work you've done on the FATF.
Great, I think we'll turn to some questions from the audience. I believe there's someone with a microphone. I'm just waiting to see where they are.
Unfortunately, the lights we can't see very well.
Because there's a question in the back. I believe that's where the microphone is right now. So we'll start with that one and then come up to the front next. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Jürgen Loos, representing BFE in Germany. We are technical advisor to media international companies. And my question is, of course, norms are extremely important. But if you look on the players worldwide, on societies, or at least on governments, of course, we have different values, different interests, different targets. So what is from your point of view the right platform to develop that further? The United Nations, the G20, to move things forward, and just taking into consideration, I mean, in the age of alternative facts, it's difficult to prove what really happened in terms of cybersecurity and attacks.
Can I deal with that? I'd like to address that because I've thought about this very deeply. For instance, why have many countries, including India, not signed on to the Budapest Convention? Because, I think you need to have something that's developed jointly where every country has a stake. And for that reason, the only body that can really do that at the moment, though it may have its flaws, though it may have its limitations, is the United Nations. The difficulty is if you do it just for a particular group of like-minded countries, the countries that are on a different page politically, geopolitically, would see that as somehow inimical to their interests, and in my opinion, that's why your only chance for getting a universally acceptable norm would be in a body like the UN. But I don't think, as I said, that it could only be between governments. I think you'd have to have parallel processes going on in the UN between the private sector and, after all, the Internet Governance Forum, and it's an offshoot of the devices and the Tunis Agenda, which is a UN initiative. So I honestly think that the danger in creating just a regional mechanism and then trying to extrapolate it and say everybody else sign on is, there'll always be countries that say that our interests haven't been taken into account when drafting this legislation. So that's my view.
I agree. I think the UN Security Council has the required resources to be responsible for something like that.
Well, actually in the UN it would be the first committee or second committee that deals with it, and not the Security Council, but finally it would have to be the UNGA.
I think one of the opportunities, but also the challenge here is to identify those areas where, despite differences, because we all know what they are, right? I mean, we have top-down, more authoritarian governance models, we have liberal democratic models, we have very market-oriented models like we see in the United States, and we don't all agree. But I think that the challenge, but also really the opportunity here, is to find those areas to begin with, where we can agree. And depending on the issue, you can find a proportionate platform. So, for example, the EU and Japan have just concluded a bilateral trade agreement. In there is a promise to look at an agreement on the free flow of data. So it's more like a positive trade-related incentive of how we're going to deal with data in the trade between us, because of course trade is also becoming more digital. So that could be relevant for that relation, and then potentially if the EU and Japan can agree, which is a huge part of global GDP, then they can also together develop their geopolitical agendas in how to deal with other areas in multilateral fora, to strengthen multilateral fora, for example, also not an agenda that everyone agrees with globally anymore, unfortunately. So I think you will also want to break it down and place it in the proportionate locations. So if you're talking about new global challenges for which there are no norms or laws, yes, then you can start in the UN. I think it makes sense, and it would also empower the UN to be relevant for the modern era. But you don't have to bring everything to the UN. And finding like-minded countries wherever they might be, I believe, is a very good opportunity too. So, for example, if the liberal democracies of this world could work together more strongly on this, whether they be in Asia or in Europe or in Latin America, this could also create a new dynamic globally.
Dr. Al-Jaber, did you have something to add? No, okay. Great. I think we had a question down front here.
Hi, this is Ayman from Qatar University. So I have a question about how would we get the private sector to actually buy into it? Just because there are usually some incentive to really be on the side of have less privacy and less security, maybe more open to attacks. even sometimes financial incentive. If you are selling cybersecurity service to Saudi Arabia and they use it instead of using it in terrorists, they are using it now to follow activists and maybe pursue them and kill them, then you are selling a service. And sometimes if you are located in a place where the laws are not very strong, it becomes a big problem. You, country A buys a service from country B, operating in country D, and there is really no accountability, and I'm still making money. So I really want your opinion of how you get the private sector, even though it has financial incentive to do what it does, to actually cooperate.
I'd like to tell you about some of the initiatives the private sector has taken globally. For instance, Microsoft and a few other major companies in the cyber world decided to create the tech accord, as they called it, the technology accord. And I think almost every one of the big internet giant companies has signed on to that. I exclude the companies in China, for example. I don't think they have, if I'm not mistaken. But certainly all the American companies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, HP, the hardware manufacturers, and I think right now they've got about 50 companies at least that have signed on. A lot of European companies have signed on. So, and the Tech Accord actually lays down certain principles that responsible industries have to accept and have to abide by. So it's not entirely profit driven. They're also setting up a digital Peace Institute, the Microsoft, and they've raised funds for it, which they say will be an NGO type organization, not-for-profit organization. So I think there is a movement within the private sector. Many countries have got working groups, joint working groups. I myself chaired a joint working group in India with the private sector. So I don't think the private sector is uninterested in seeing that cyberspace stays safer. Because if they were driven only by a profit motive, then ultimately they also realize that this whole medium will get corrupted if we don't address the question of security. So there is a certain self-interest in making it safer.
Well, sometimes I'm going to be a little bit more challenging here, because I've worked on export control regulations from the EU, because I think a lot of companies are not acting in good faith, unfortunately, and it is also up to governments and parliaments to lay minimum standards. And so what we said in European Parliament is, if you make hacking or surveillance systems in Europe and you want to export them to countries where human rights violations are a known problem, then you need a specific license which can be granted or denied, because the EU believes that human rights should be respected, and it also has binding impact on companies. Now, the private sector was initially quite worried, because they said, you know, it's over-regulation and we don't want to lose market share, etc. But then a lot of them, I think, came around, one, in knowing that this is a very specific part of the market, doesn't touch everyone, but it touches specific often not very public-facing companies. But also imagine, fast forward 10 years, where China could be the strongest in exporting, hacking, tracking, tracing, surveillance systems. Then we in Europe may actually be quite happy that we have mechanisms to say, there are criteria before which we want product A, B, or C to sort of roam freely on our markets, right?
I think we're talking about two types of private company. Private company that they follow rule and regulation. Big company like Microsoft or any small company that they are 100% within certain jurisdiction and they are following rule. But the majority of the attack, they've been created by underground companies. And there's a huge black market for it. For them, none of the rule and regulation can stop them. The only thing is the dollar. And the more you will be paying for that specific software that will find a vulnerability on any software, I will sell it to you without going through any guidance or any. And I think that's the worry. I understand if the private sector but the majority of those software, they come from unstructured and legal, and it is really huge. The black market for cyber security, it's extremely big. So I think it will be very hard. It will be very hard to incentivize them unless you will pay them more money to not sell this thing.
Well, thank you very much. If we can have a round of applause for our panelists. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of the questions, but I think this is a conversation we can have for many years to come and watch the updates that are going on. Truly a dynamic topic. Thank you again.
Thank you, Kate.